Welcome everybody to today's Thursday, July 17th SunSpec webinar on solar energy cybersecurity threats and new strategies for grid resilience. My name is Dylan Tansy. I'm the Executive Director of SunSpec Alliance, and we have a great lineup of presenters and speakers we're excited to have you join us to hear from. We have a lot to get through, so we're just going to get right into it. Next slide, please, Jay. Starting with the antitrust and intellectual property provisions. All SunSpec meetings are conducted in accordance with the SunSpec antitrust policy and intellectual property provisions defined in the SunSpec member agreement. This agreement can be found at the following address. SunSpec strictly prohibits market participants and their employees who take part in these activities from using their participation as a forum for engaging in practices or communications that violate antitrust laws. Confidential or proprietary information should not be discussed in open session. Please contact SunSpec management if you have any questions. A couple housekeeping items. This meeting is being recorded. We will distribute it after the fact. The slides and deck will also be distributed. This meeting is being ran on Google Meet, so everybody does have the ability to unmute themselves, but we do request that you keep yourself on mute for the duration of the meeting. There will be a section at the end of the webinar for open Q&A and panel discussion. So you can put your questions in the chat throughout the meeting, and we'll do our best to get through as many of them as we can with the time available at the end. But otherwise, please do keep your camera and mic off during the webinar to keep background noise to a minimum. Today's speakers include Dr. Paul Stockton, who's a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, Jay Johnson, CTO of DERSec Corp, and Tom Tansy, CEO. Sorry, Jay Johnson is CTO, Tom Tansy, CEO of DERSec Security Corp. Again, my name is Dylan Tansy. I'm the Executive Director of the SunSpec Alliance. I want to highlight Dr. Paul Stockton's profile very quickly here. Paul is a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, and has done extensive work in the U.S. Department of Energy and Department of Defense, and presents to you a fairly U.S.-centric perspective on our cybersecurity threats and strategies. He's recently published a report called "Surfing the Wave: Resilience Strategies for the Decentralized Grid," much of the content of which he's presenting today is drawn from. Now, SunSpec is an alliance made up of 2/3 non-US companies. However, I strongly believe that the information and strategies that Paul will be presenting here today are really worthwhile for everybody to understand, whether you're a non-US company doing business in the US or in your own home market. The strategies and considerations are largely the same. Obviously, there will be some US unique elements here presented. So we're excited to present all this to you. Next slide. So the agenda for today, we're going to start with Jay Johnson presenting on vulnerabilities in PV systems and reviewing recent cyber attacks, largely drawn from the Cybersecurity Vulnerabilities Report, Volume 1 and 2, that have been published by DERSec Corp over the last year, the most recent Volume 2 being published in May. From there, Paul will take over, presenting on strategies for leveraging DER for grid resilience and as a national security asset. So this is the strategies and also business opportunities for the professionals and members of the industry. Finally, at the end, Tom will moderate a panel Q&A, so he has some pre-prepared questions to ask them, and we'll also do our best to get through whatever questions you have that you put in the chat throughout the webinar, and we'll have an open mic session at that time as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Jay, CTO of DERSec Corp. Thanks so much, Jay.
Awesome, Dylan. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and good morning, everyone. Happy to talk about my favorite subject, cybersecurity for PV systems and distributed energy resources. And as Dylan said, I will primarily be talking about some of the findings that we shared in a recent DER security report. The report shown here is the public history of solar energy cyber attacks and vulnerabilities, and you can go download it right now from DERSec.io. In this report, we talk quite extensively about the CVEs and vulnerabilities and public cyber attacks that have been disclosed over the course of the last decade or so. And now it's worth noting that those are likely just the tip of the iceberg. In a lot of situations, cyber attacks or other vulnerabilities are reported and handled internally. And so there may actually be quite a few additional vulnerabilities that have been around for a long time and out in the wild. But from what we can see in the public literature and in kind of cybersecurity conferences and other things, there's also been a pretty good body of work there. I think it's on the order of about 125, 130 or so CVEs that have been published in the solar space. And if you look at all those things and what they impact, we've concluded after crunching the numbers that somewhere around 45% or 1.1 terawatts of worldwide solar generation was produced by manufacturers that had some sort of vulnerability in their cloud infrastructure, the inverters, gateways, or other component in this system. And quite a few cybersecurity researchers have demonstrated that there are ways to interact with these devices to, for instance, upload malicious firmware that can impact the physical operations of the equipment. In fact, I've got a nice video at the end of my talk to show just that. And then lastly, in terms of impact, what we have seen is a recent report coming from Solar Power Europe that you can start to cause cascading grid outages in the EU at about 100 gigawatts of generation. And there are several vendors that reach that penetration level, that threshold. And so if you compromise cloud infrastructure or other command and control systems to interact with that much generation, there's a risk of cascading outages. Okay, so the vulnerabilities in cyber attacks plotted over the course of the last 13 years or so are shown here. You can see an upward trend as we've come along, and that is likely to increase even in 2025. We have the first half of the year shown here, but there could be more. I will be quick to note that this doesn't necessarily mean that systems are less secure now. It just means that the industry is maturing, and we're doing a better job of coordinated vulnerability disclosures and getting the information out there that you need to patch and update your equipment when there are problems detected. And I guess because there's so much interest in this space now, we've also been seeing an increase in cyber attacks, primarily around kind of international conflicts, which I'll go through in a moment. But the components that have had these CVEs or vulnerabilities or cyber attacks are shown on the right here. The majority is solar monitors, but also gateways, inverters, and cloud infrastructure also contribute quite a bit to that. There's a range of different threat vectors for this ecosystem. I'm showing a handful here, and I guess I'll just quickly go through these. So on the left side, you've got more of the infrastructure side. So you've got your cloud architectures that often have some sort of interaction with the equipment that will communicate either reverse SSH tunnels or MQTT or some other backhaul protocol to get information to and from the devices. That's used for telemetry and providing users their data on their smartphone apps, but it's also used for firmware updates and other things. And so if you compromise the cloud architecture or infrastructure, or you have some sort of insider threat at these companies, you can push malicious set points or firmware or other things down to the endpoints and actually impact the OT operations there. Likewise, there's been a lot of work, especially in the vehicle space, about insecure APIs. I'll talk a little bit about this here in a moment. And then malicious over-the-air firmware updates, which can leverage some of these other vulnerabilities. And then at the device level, there's quite a bit of work that's been done there. There's your standard control interfaces. A lot of these devices have web servers. They communicate MQTT or Telnet or have SSH access to the equipment that you can leverage to get into those devices and potentially root them. The supply chain threat is ever present because, and I guess if you believe the Reuters report, there's even some components being added to inverters that allow remote connectivity that is not documented. And then the adverse local interfaces are just those that are programmed directly into the device. So sometimes there's a front panel or some other maintenance interface like JTAG or something like that that you can get into. And so with that, there have been several cyber attacks, 6 of which we've documented. So the first one, and this is actually the first cyber attack on the US power grid, period. And it occurred to wind and solar, of all things, in California, Utah, and Wyoming over the course of 10 or 12 hours. And what happened was there was an unpatched Cisco firewall that somebody was able to basically cause to reboot repeatedly over and over and over, which prevented visibility into those assets. And eventually they caught on to this and patched the device and fixed the issue. But this was reported to DOE, and it was the first time that there's actually been a physical, like an impact to visibility or control of the US power grid. In 2023, Palo Alto Networks Unit 42 reported that AP Systems gateways were being leveraged for the Mirai botnet. This is, in this particular case, they were leveraging a critical vulnerability where you could do code injection into the time zone parameter and get remote root access to those devices. So any of these devices that were connected to the public internet were then compromised and put into this botnet to do malicious, typically DDoS attacks on other assets. In December 26, 2023, there was a report out from Romania that indicated that the volt-watt function was being modified in customer sites in order to produce more energy. So for those that don't know, volt-watt basically says as you increase your voltage, you're gonna curtail active power a little bit to provide grid stability. And people wanted to make more money. They wanted to produce more energy. And so they changed that function to produce high power at high voltage using the installer codes for these solar inverters, which they got access to somehow. And so there were, in this report, in this paper, they were indicating that the grid operators were struggling a little bit because the pre-programmed volt-watt function had been modified. More recently, 800 Contact SolarView, these are solar monitoring devices, were compromised. These are typically mostly deployed in Japan. In this case, they were compromised and put into a botnet and used to orchestrate fraudulent bank transfers, basically hiding the tracks of the adversary so that they could route that through a different device and cover their tracks. I think, if I recall correctly, a South Korean company was able to attribute the attack to an APT, an Arsenal Depository Group that was likely of Chinese or Russian kind of backing. And then in September 1, 2024, pro-Russian hacktivist Just Evil gained access to 22 PV sites These included some on schools and medical facilities. Some of the original reporting indicated that this was also tied to military installations, but after talking with those that helped with the incident response, it turned out I think it was mostly medical emergency facilities. But they gained access to this equipment doing, I think, just kind of traditional social engineering and getting the passwords and gaining access, or potentially brute forcing their way into this thing. I don't think we know. And then lastly, I'm not sure if this is tied to the exact same event that happened on the left here, but Chinese-linked cyber actors were reported by the FBI and several other intelligence agencies as compromising routers and IoT devices into botnet operations. And in this case, they were indicating that the contact devices were also used for that. So it could be a similar campaign, or maybe a separate one using that remote code execution to provide that access to that equipment. So you're saying, well, how is this done? What's going on here? Well, there's a couple of different ways. There's kind of the front door and the back door option, or the direct attack, what I call the direct attack, and the back door attack, right? So you can basically find these devices on the internet. If you use Shodan or something similar, there, as reported by Forescout recently, there's 35,000 solar power devices out on the internet right now, publicly exposed. If there's some sort of vulnerability associated with those, you can compromise them and gain access. Unfortunately, if you scour the internet, you'll find a lot of default passwords, installer passwords, etc., that provide you with more access than you should have, all the way to the point of like shutting down the systems or modifying settings. And so that's one way to get in. Another way that actually frightens me more is the indirect attack. And this is where you use some sort of compromised cloud infrastructure APIs to remotely update the entire fleet of systems. And if you couple this with some of the work by European researcher Sebastian, who goes by the name Vegan MOSFET, you can push malicious firmware. And so I'd like to talk you through this, like keep you up at night scenario, and just explain how this might work and why we should be paying close attention to preventing this. So it's kind of a two-step thing, right? First, you have to get access to the fleet. And so a Greek researcher, Stikis, presented at OWASP Lisbon last year the compromise of, I believe, 6 different cloud infrastructures, including this one, where you can see the active firmware for gateways and inverters for this vendor. And this allowed remote firmware update to the gateways and inverters via this platform. Here's another one, again from the Stikis presentation, where there are, let's see here, 219,000 different endpoints, devices that were accessible using what they call the super user portal access. And so this also had the ability to update firmware on these systems. So now you couple that with some of the work that Sebastian has done, and I'll point to his Chaos Congress presentation back in December 2023 as really the kind of scariest demonstration of what could go wrong, where he was able to, in this case, modify the firmware on a Hoy Miles microinverter by uploading via man-in-the-middle attack malicious shellcode. And he put in here a logic bomb that at a particular instant in time, it would change the logic of the IGBT switching signals to the gate, to the bridge, the H bridge. And with that, he could trigger he could do that. He could also trigger the AC or grid relay. He could produce, reactive power, or increase total harmonic distortion, or do a lot of power system related manipulations. And in this presentation, it was possible to also update all the devices using a separate thing. So I'm going to play this, and I hope the audio comes through to everybody. I press the button. And he's basically going to manipulate the device and show you what that looks like. First one, he's going to manipulate the IGBT's switching signal. And let's take a look at
that. You can see on the picture, but you can also hear. I amplified the sound a little bit. You can also hear the grid side relay toggling. So we manage also after 5 minutes after the DTU stops to manipulate the behavior of the inverter.
Okay, now the proof of concept number 2 here is controlling. Oh, I guess
as I said, I wanted to see how fast we can hit the device.
Heat up the device.
But something unexpected happened. Now you see the temperature increases. Oh!
Uh-oh, we're lagging. Oh, all right. Well, he goes in and he shows that the his breaker at his house had tripped, right? So it is my suspicion that by trying to heat up the device by changing the triggering signal to the IGB or MOSFET bridge in this case, that he accidentally closed the line-to-line phase, and it basically caused a fault on the system and tripped the device. And so the point of this is, look, we've got 200,000 devices that are accessible by the cloud infrastructure with the ability to push firmware updates. And Sebastian has shown that you can modify this firmware such that at a time of your choosing, you can modify that to cause grid protection devices to trip, shutting down entire homes or businesses, or maybe even upstream of that. So that is truly a frightening scenario, right? Something that we need to protect against as best we can. Now, there's a lot that we could go into about how best practices weren't followed in these particular cases, but one of the ways that we can do better is start to adopt better cybersecurity certification programs. And also, I would contend, push for more regulation in the US at probably the federal level. There's been a lot of talk about whether this is a state or a federal concern, but I think we should take a page from the EU in this and move toward something equivalent to the NIST 2 or CRA, Cyber Resilience Act, and start to globally apply some requirements for distributed energy because it's just too late. And then the kind of on the device level, an area that I've worked quite a bit is the certification testing, cyber certification testing for these devices. There's many options out there. In fact, the UL 2941 was just voted on a couple of weeks ago, and it passed. So there's a ANSI consensus-based standard for safety for cybersecurity of distributed energy and inverter-based resources. There's the SunSpec Alliance base level cybersecurity certification as well. And then if you want to orient yourself more toward the global community, you could adopt IEC 6443-4-2, probably security level 2 to begin, or even higher, which recently was adopted by Australia and many other places as good guidance for device level or equipment level requirements for this. And so I will conclude my remarks by just saying that vulnerability disclosure is essential. This is a good thing. That ramp that we were seeing doesn't necessarily mean that there are more problems. It means that we're getting the word out, we're fixing these things. This is good. And you know, being able to talk about it and do a coordinated vulnerability disclosure is really essential for a healthy cybersecurity ecosystem in this space. All right, I'll turn it over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Jay. That was terrific, but also a little bit scary. Thanks especially for suggesting towards the end what we can do about these challenges. Let me first offer the usual disclaimer. Nothing I say represents the policies of the Department of Energy or Department of Defense. But let me also emphasize, thanks to SunSpec Alliance and all of you for what you're accomplishing to transition us to much stronger, more effective energy system. Next slide, please. As we've just heard, we've got serious challenges to the grid via cloud-based updates, everything else that we've talked about, as well as supply chains, the other threat vectors. And these dangers are going to intensify as we get more and more deployment of these assets. But we're missing the upside. Folks, I want to issue a call of arms today. There's a terrific opportunity to make the case to sustain and grow the deployment of distributed energy resources in the national security realm. We're missing a chance to tackle this issue head on and take on the critics of DER deployments by emphasizing the potential value of DERs to support national defense, if and only if we can secure these systems from the kinds of attack vectors that Jay was just discussing. So you can see the bottom line here. It's reflected in the study that I did for the Applied Physics Laboratory. I'm going to talk about it now. We need to surf the wave. No chance to rip and replace DERs that are deployed by the millions across the United States. Instead, we need to find ways of leveraging these deployments to make the nation safer against attacks by People's Republic of China or other potential adversaries. Next slide, please. So this is what I'm going to cover today. Let's start by talking about what's good about DERs for national security, and not only for the United States, but for all of the partner nations represented in on this call. And we'll talk about some specific security benefits that you see, and then also what we have to do to make it real. Because absent some aggressive cybersecurity initiatives, we're going to be worse off with DERs than we are today as deployments expand. Next slide, please. You'd be a fool to try to guess how the grid is going to continue to evolve. And I was shocked by the unexpected rise in demand, especially by large loads. And incidentally, if you haven't seen the recent NIST study on large loads and their implications for grid reliability and resilience, talking about Bitcoin mining, AI data centers, take a look at that. But even though it's difficult to predict the future with any certainty, there are three trends that are already decentralizing the grid. And you're familiar with all of these. First of all, the nationwide dispersal of DERs, massive growth in battery energy storage systems, which thank goodness is continuing. And of course, the rise of distributed energy resource management systems that increasingly take advantage of AI tools for decision support and, in some cases, automation. Next slide. Of course, the risk is that as we add more and more DER to the United States grid, the bad guys are going to attack the bulk power system by exploiting these DERs. And some of you are familiar with a terrific Department of Energy report from a couple of years ago on DER cybersecurity risks, especially the danger that there'll be common mode failures. That is, widely deployed DERs will have similar exploit opportunities that the bad guys can take advantage of simultaneously nationwide to cause DERs to trip off, to create potentially voltage and frequency instabilities using advanced inverter capabilities. That risk of multiple nationwide DER failures or exploitations. That's the threat that we need to talk about. So those are the risks that we talk about all the time, but I'm suggesting that we need to flip the script. And as we'll discuss now, talk about the national security upside of DERs. First, of course, as we see on this slide, is microgrids. There are all kinds of opportunities now for microgrids to sustain service to critical loads in military and civilian facilities that are unparalleled compared to the bad old days where you had to rely on stored diesel fuel for emergency generators, other ways of segmenting your power island from the grid and sustaining service. And there's all kinds of progress being made on SMRs. As you know, the Department of Defense, Department of Energy now are aggressively pursuing SMRs. On remote military bases in Alaska and elsewhere, the use cases are strong. Obviously, there are cost issues associated with SMRs that make broader use challenging at this stage. But I'm here to say that microgrids aren't going to solve all our problems. Many times, in the case of military bases, for example, the water system on which the base relies, it's outside the fence line of the military base. And if water service goes down, as all of you know, you're dead in the water. And of course, if China or another adversary were to conduct nationwide attacks, we need many thousands of microgrids to enable critical facilities to stay up and running once they segmented from the grid. I'm going to advocate for something different in my next study for the Applied Physics Laboratory, that we think about establishing and pre-planning for very, very large power islands. Think about the entire PJM service territory. I'm sorry, say again? Think about the entire PJM service territory separating in order to protect that area from cascading power failures. But microgrids in the near term, they're terrific. Next, decentralized black start restoration. It's great that we have cranking paths that transmission system operators are ready to employ. They're training to it. There's all kinds of NERC standards requiring them to keep ready for black start restoration. The problem is we've got a small number of cranking paths that restart the grid from inside a blacked out area, as all of you know. And China and other adversaries for sure are targeting those cranking paths for disruption. We ought to decentralize power restoration and using grid forming capable inverters deployed on battery energy storage systems, get ready to be able to start up very large numbers of power islands simultaneously and gradually integrate them, synchronize them, so we can reestablish the interconnections. Obviously, that's going to entail a lot of technical problems and even more operational problems, so you can balance generation with load, for example. But let's get rolling. Next slide. And of course, resilience against kinetic attacks. Thus far, Jay and I have been talking about cyber threats to DERs. But geez, all you have to do is look at Ukraine's successful attacks on Russian bomber bases thousands of miles away from Ukraine's borders by using pre-deployed unmanned aerial systems. Folks, that could be coming to the United States thanks to China or other adversaries very soon. And as Ukraine has done to defend its own grid against attack, the best way to protect critical nodes of the electric system is to not have any. Let's continue to disperse our generation, transmission, and distribution resources so that they're inherently more survivable against kinetic attack. Next slide. Of course, in order to make this real, we got to do a lot of work. First of all, threshold issue, we got to be able to have DERs that can ride through disturbances as opposed to tripping off, as in the Blue Cut fire and many other instances. And frequency and voltage support is going to be critical as we deploy more and more DERs. And there's some problems in making sure that states mandate the adoption of these more capable inverters. Got to make progress on that. We also have to mitigate the risk of the common mode failures I discussed before. And I'm especially concerned with two types of attacks: supply chain compromises and living on off the land attacks that we'll talk about now. Next slide. Supply chain security. Obviously, we've got a plethora of Chinese components and subcomponents deployed across the DER ecosystem. We've got to do a better job of not only testing these devices and their software and their firmware down to the chip level, but especially sharing these findings with industry and the owners and operators and procurement officers who are building out the DER system. We've got big problems here in this sharing. There are a lot of folks on this call, I bet, who do not have top secret security clearances. And we need to be able to get valid testing findings on the most dangerous products out to those who are purchasing products and building out our DER system. Next slide. I think we ought to take a step, Jay alluded to earlier, with nationwide measures and bar utilities and non-utility entities, including aggregators and VPPs, from buying products from China or elsewhere that pose catastrophic threats. The puzzle, of course, is one of phasing. If we were to rip and replace all Chinese devices from distribution level systems and inverter-based systems that are tied to the bulk electric system, we'd be in deep trouble. We'd have a reliability event in states such as California and Texas. So we need to phase the implementation of any such prohibitions as we ramp up production by the United States producers and those security partner nations on the call today. We need to align prohibition orders with the availability of safer products. Next slide. Living off the land attacks scare me the most. And riffing off what Jay said, you don't need the implantation of very fancy compromises tailored to specific devices. Heck, if you can upload firmware alterations via the cloud to thousands or potentially millions of devices simultaneously, you can then exploit those devices to trip off, to alter voltage and frequency in a given region. We've got Volt Typhoon. It's got a lot of people concerned, but that, as I say, is just the tip of the iceberg. So the way to go is to strengthen defense in depth. Protect communications, maybe constrain device performance so that, for example, if we've got ranges of adjustability for voltage and frequency control pursuant to IEEE 1547, got to be able to have that. Maybe we don't need too much functionality that adversaries could exploit. They get their hands on it. And then I'll talk later during Q&A, I hope, about how to use DERMs so they can limit the impact of successful attacks. Next slide. Problem, of course, as Jay alluded to, is we got a lot of states out there and territories. Territories very important in the case of Guam and CNMI. The adoption of voluntary guidelines by IEEE and other sources of guidelines is very uneven. It's slow and uneven compared with the pace and intensification of the threat. And that maybe was okay in what I call the good old days before DERs provided such an important contribution to the overall electric grid, but now that's no longer acceptable. Letting each state do its own thing and having voluntary guidelines that may or may not be complied with, that is so yesterday. Next slide. So the obvious answer is, well, let's just apply FERC and NERC standards to distribution level entities. Well, that ain't gonna happen. Congress is never gonna go with that. we've got to have distribution level regulators and their partners, including NARUC and especially the SunSpec Alliance, continue to drive progress forward. I don't believe that we're going to ever get Congress to reallocate authority under the Federal Power Act. And what I'm advocating for here is let's take the terrific standards that are already out there for voluntary compliance, and the very most valuable ones, let's make them mandatory and use interconnection agreements and product whitelists as the hammer by states to enforce compliance. Next slide. Of course, there's a lot of great work being done at the bulk power system level. Some of that work can be adapted and applied to distribution provider and DER requirements. And there's some specific opportunities that I cover in my report. And please do look at that APL report that SunSpec has provided the link to. And I think especially we need to make sure that emerging mandatory standards apply to aggregators and VPP operators, and not just distribution utilities. And there's a lot of questions out there amongst public utility commissions in many states as to whether they have the authority to impose requirements on aggregators. Let's fix that. Let's make sure that aggregators fall under the purview of PUCs going forward. Next slide. Of course, I'm talking about the challenges that already exist today. We've got bigger challenge to come. And the basic problem is we're developing and deploying new technologies way ahead of the regulations that can help secure them. We're constantly playing catch up. We got to get out in front of problems rather than trying to close gaps when they're already as wide as the Grand Canyon. And artificial intelligence, of course, exemplifies this problem. So you'll see that Dylan, thank you, has put up the web link to the study. I go into significant detail on the AI challenges that we face as more and more DER and DERMs can leverage the availability of new AI tools. But where is the software coming for this AI? How can we secure it and prevent it from, again, becoming a new threat vector of living off the land attacks? Next slide. So thank you for all you're doing to help not only transform the grid in a terrifically valuable direction, but also turn that transformation into a national security advantage for the United States and all the security partners on the call today. And of course, welcome follow-up from you. You see my email address. I do answer my emails, so please contact me directly if I can assist. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Paul. And yeah, I think that's a really great key takeaway is that the opportunity here is to move beyond using DER to address things like climate change and promote it in terms of being a national security asset. So thank you for your comments. With that, I'm going to pass it off to Tom, who's going to lead the question and answer portion. Like I mentioned at the beginning, he does have some preloaded questions, but you are welcome to put your own questions in the chat or raise your hand and unmute yourself to ask questions directly. So Tom, please take it from here.
Great, thanks Dylan, and thanks Jay and Paul for a great and a very thought-provoking presentation. So to reiterate what Dylan said, we're going to get to your questions, so please do put them into the chat now so we can queue them up. Meanwhile, I want to double click on the supply chain versus the regulatory environment issue. And so the statement is that, most solar, wind, and storage markets around the globe, including the US, depend upon equipment that is either made in China or that has a high percentage of Chinese content. And supply chains for these newer plants have a similar makeup and dependence. So anything that's in the pipeline today, it's got the same characteristics as the installed base. And so that given that no market can avoid this dependence in the short term because regulation doesn't turn that fast and neither does the manufacturing companies that have to build these things. If we adopt the plan that you folks have sort of laid out to address the risks that Jay was so eloquently pointed out, so how do we manage through what is bound to be a multi-year transition? So what are the things that we can do right now to start this journey?
Jay, you
Should I
want
go
to
first, Paul? Well, yeah, I think the device level requirements that I pointed out would be a clear first step. There's also a lot that we could do in terms of where communications are originating and how they are reaching the equipment. And so I know that even white label devices that appear to be from U.S. companies or friendly nation companies actually have firmware pushed from China in a lot of cases. And so this idea of, oh, well, we'll just, prevent any firmware updates that are originating outside of the borders or something like that, well, that's not going to solve it. And cloud architecture can be deployed anywhere, right? It's spun up here, there, wherever. It could be US based or not. And it's just whoever has access to that infrastructure to push those updates. So I think it's a very complicated problem. The device level stuff, simple things like code signing for firmware updates would prevent that Hoy Miles attack, as an example. That's a no-brainer. It's included in pretty much every single one of those 3 different device level requirements. And we gotta raise the bar a little bit to be deployed in the US and elsewhere. We gotta do better. Paul?
Yeah, I would add to the risk posed by the push of firmware updates. It's possible that adversary militaries and intelligence agencies would gain access to those push communications links, even if the OEM, the original equipment manufacturer, didn't intend to be an attack vector. Of course, they could be exploited. I would go back to the argument I made a little earlier that we need to not only bolster U.S. and allied manufacturing of critical products so that procurement officers have safer ones available, but we need to take a harsh risk-based approach, not focused so much on threat and vulnerability, because that's really hard to manage, but especially consequence. We need to assume that the bad guys are going to be able to pull off a successful attack on DER and DERMS and build layers of defense against the consequences of that. And above all, focus prohibition orders on the very most dangerous products that best enable adversaries to create interconnection-wide cascading failures, uncontrolled separation, and large-scale, long-duration outages. Let's focus on that and let the small stuff, take care of itself. Get national laboratories and information sharing systems to better provide data to procurement officers on what kind of stuff can really take the nation down. And let's go after that in a narrowly focused way.
It's really interesting. I haven't heard that mentioned too often, to actually focus in on the procurement officers, but and so I think that's a key insight here. So my second question is, and I've been an advocate for this position I'm going to propose here, which is to separate the control plane of these systems from the power conversion plane. And I've been saying this for some time, and of course the criticism or challenges like, well, that's kind of hard to pull off. So, but I'm now seeing some inklings of it from our European colleagues that maybe they're taking a shot at this. So my question is, are there communication network solutions that can minimize the risk of for control or adverse manipulation? So what can we do with our existing datacom networks?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple examples that we can point to explain this, right? So the first is take that Romanian cyber attack where it was manipulating a standard grid support function. Anytime you would query that device, you would see that change in settings and parameters. And if you deployed some sort of network-based intrusion detection system, you could pick that up. If you had some back-end logic to indicate whether it was configured to the local grid code requirements, you could easily flag that as anomalous and then push the update to basically revert it back to known good state. In the case of firmware updates, it's a little more challenging, right? You're not going to be tearing apart binaries on the fly. But what you can do is if there is a firmware update, you can analyze the behavior of the device and see if anything has changed. Is it looking like it's operating normally, or is it producing 50% of its nameplate capacity all of a sudden? Or is it just off? Is there something that's happened on a physical level that's changed its operations based on these updates? And so I think maybe from my perspective, tying together the two different things, Paul, your consequence-based orientation. Yeah, let's look at the physics of what's going on. Let's look at what's actually happening to the power system and use that as our ground truth to determine if things are good or bad. And then from your side, Tom, on the communication side, we can absolutely look at what's going across the wire, what's happening to these devices. Are there firmware updates? Are there control changes? Are there commands that are coming at times that they shouldn't? Are there setting updates that are outside IEEE 1547 ranges of adjustability? That's very easy to detect.
That's it.
None of that stuff is currently deployed and could be deployed pretty easily. Paul?
Tom, I'd like to raise the level of this discussion beyond device functionality to the overall communications networks on which grid performance and grid reliability depends. The longer we're watching Volt Typhoon, the uglier it gets. Just yesterday, we learned that Volt Typhoon has infected critical state National Guard networks. If you think that you're going to have internet service from an ISP or telecom support for your distribution provider operations, for VVPs, for aggregators, you're smoking the strong stuff. We are in a situation now where we need to discuss not only adversary exploitation of device level communications, but also the broader context of DER operation and control and distribution system management and the ties between distribution systems and the bulk power system as a critical emerging threat vector. Because as I say, it's tough to keep up with the consequences of Volt Typhoon. And in your spare time, look up the latest reporting on Silk Typhoon, which is potentially the scariest attack vector now that the PRC has underway to exploit vulnerable communications.
Interesting. Great. Hey, I want to get to some audience questions here. I'll start with Kevin Lackey. And
we have a queue here. Steve raised his hand first, so we'll let Steve go first here.
okay, fair enough. Steve, go ahead.
Hey, Steve, did you have a question? All right, if not, we can move on to Scott. Scott, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, and I also put the question in the chat, but it seems that for the first time, utilities now have to be worried about the security of devices that they don't own, right? The behind the meter, consumer owned, et cetera, like solar inverters. So how should utilities think about the security of those devices and the impact of those on the grid, since now, again, devices that they don't own can impact the resiliency of the grid?
I'll take a whack at that one first.
Sure.
Scott, it's a great question, and it highlights the importance of having a defense in depth strategy. If there's stuff you don't own and you didn't buy, that now can affect the reliability and functionality of your distribution system, you need to be ready to manage the consequences of an attack at the distribution level. And Jay, I'm so grateful to hear that you and your company are working on ways to leverage existing distributed energy resource management systems to add cybersecurity and incident management capabilities to those frameworks. I think that's, Scott, an example of the way we need to go. We need to assume, given the problem that you've raised, that adversaries are going to be able to create frequency and voltage instabilities, trip off devices, etc. We've got to be able to manage those and limit the consequences of attacks.
Yeah, I'll just follow up by, sorry,
Got it.
a little echo. Yeah, I think we can do a lot here, right? Because there's utility interconnection requirements that are passed down to the customers. And if you, as a utility or whoever the grid operator is, say that you're not going to interconnect to our power system unless you have XYZ certification, that puts the pressure on these manufacturers to get these certifications. And so similar things have been done. Look at like PPL's qualified inverter list for IEEE 1547 compliance. Similar things could be done where you would say you have to have UL 2941 certification, as an example, prior to being interconnected to our power system. And that would raise the bar significantly in that region to add that security layer to those devices. The other thing and I realize we're short on time, but real quickly, this is one of the sticking points that's come up over and over again. I had so many conversations with DOE back when I was working for Sandia on this topic, and we had White House engaged and DOD, DOE, others, and it's like, who owns this stuff? Who owns the responsibility for providing cybersecurity here? The customers buy this stuff, they connect it to the power system, but ultimately the grid operators are responsible for reliability and maintenance of the power system. And so who gets blamed for when things go wrong? Who's responsible for updating these things? Who's the responsible party in these cases? And so I think there are levers that can be pulled to help in this particular case to raise the bar, as I'm saying.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. Cybersecurity is a team sport. The states and the feds can lay out the rules of the road for the highways, but they don't drive the cars. That's up to the individuals to drive the cars and obey the laws and not crash into people. It's no different here in the power system. There is a shared responsibility. And so this notion that it's all on one party or the other is just, I think is just problematic. So again, we are short on time here. So Dylan, do I have a chance for one more question?
Yeah, go ahead and take Kevin Lackey's written question as the next one in the queue.
Great. Okay. Very good. So this is a good one. I can't wait to hear the answer. So with known undocumented cell modems bundled into smart inverters, what are the current mitigation strategies being investigated versus rogue voltage and frequency attacks? Smart meters with detection capabilities and the ability to disconnect. So what say you about these hidden modems?
Well, our approach at DERSecurity is that however the adversary is doing the bad stuff, could be physically cutting the fence and going on site and plugging in a laptop into a USB or JTAG or serial port or something like that. It could be rogue modems. It could be other cloud-based attacks. It doesn't matter. What we're doing is we're focused on the physical behavior of the equipment, comparing that to out-of-band data sources that are captured from on-site meters or other devices, and then comparing those two things. So say there's some critical supply chain vulnerability that allows the adversary to manipulate these devices. We can still pick that up regardless of how they get in and flag that as an issue. The real question then becomes, well, what do you do about it? And so that's where the kind of red team, blue team games get interesting. And how do you respond and isolate those devices, or roll them back to known good states and so forth. And that's a whole nother conversation.
Very good. All right. Well, Paul, it looks like you get the last word here.
Yeah, my last word, Tom, to you, everybody at SunSpec, Jay, and especially the folks who joined us today. Thank you so much for what you're doing to build a better electric system, and one that can have immense national security advantages if only we can secure these capabilities.
All right. I echo those comments. Thank you so much for your participation today, and thanks for the great speakers. Dylan, I'll turn it over to you to take it home.
Great. Thanks so much, Tom and Paul and Jay. Really great discussion and presentation here. We appreciate it. So we go to the next slide, Jay, real quick to wrap up. So please do reach out to us and download the reports that have been referenced in today's webinar. We will be distributing the slides afterwards, so you'll have these links. If you would like to get in touch with SunSpec, come to our website, email membership@sunspec.org. And I want to highlight one last thing on the next slide. Actually, just hop forward 2 slides. We did put together a little bit of a index of the relevant cybersecurity standards for you to refer to. So there's a long list here that I encourage you to come to the website and get the deck, so you can see this whole infrastructure or economy of cybersecurity standards for you to be paying attention to. So with that, thank you everybody for your time. Thank you to our presenters and panel. It's a great webinar, and we'll see you guys in the next one.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.